The cooling fan in the server rack screamed, a high-pitched whine that Vyro had learned to ignore weeks ago. He sat hunched over a terminal, his fingers moving across the keys in a rhythmic, aggressive blur. Around him, the room was a graveyard of dismantled hardware and tangled copper wire. He did not look for comfort, he looked for the seams. Every textbook on his desk claimed the universe was governed by rigid, unchangeable laws. Vyro knew better. He hit the enter key, waiting for the simulation to stabilize, but the screen flickered. A line of code turned red. A calculation that should have resolved into a constant had collapsed into a variable. He leaned in, his breath hitching. It was not a glitch in his machine. It was a glitch in the air itself. He tapped the monitor, his pulse quickening. The world outside looked solid, but for the first time, he saw it for what it truly was. It was a draft, and he was the only one holding the pen. Vyro pulled the terminal closer, his eyes scanning the raw data stream. If reality was a draft, there had to be an interface. He bypassed the standard physics subroutines and began isolating the background noise he had recorded for months. He filtered out the static, the thermal hum, and the electromagnetic interference. What remained was a rhythmic pulse, a sequence of data packets that didn't belong to any known physical law. He called it the LittyWay. It was the source code of the environment, a hidden layer of instructions that dictated the behavior of matter. He ran a test, inputting a simple command to shift the frequency of a copper wire on his desk. He watched the screen, his fingers hovering over the keys. The wire didn't just heat up, it vibrated in place, its atomic structure momentarily loosening before snapping back into position. He did it again, slower this time. The wire blurred, turning into a semi-transparent ghost of itself. He wasn't just observing the universe anymore, he was reading its syntax. He realized that if he could isolate the LittyWay, he could rewrite the environment itself. He was no longer a student of physics, he was a developer of existence. Vyro stopped answering his phone. He stopped leaving the room. The project demanded more than his current hardware could provide, so he went hunting. He spent nights in the industrial district, stripping discarded server racks and salvaging high-end processors from dumpsters behind tech firms. He dragged the components back to his workspace, his hands stained with grease and metallic dust. He didn't sleep. He built. He soldered circuits until his eyes burned, weaving a chaotic web of wires that spanned the entire floor. The machine grew, a jagged, pulsing monument of salvaged tech. It needed more power than the building could supply, so he bypassed the main breaker. Sparks showered the floor every time he initialized a boot sequence. He lived on caffeine and raw data, his environment shrinking to the glow of the monitors. The neighbors knocked, but he didn't hear them over the roar of the processors. He was deep inside the machine now, his mind tethered to the code. He had built the bridge between his intent and the fabric of reality, and he was ready to cross it. Vyro sat before the terminal, his fingers hovering over the mechanical keyboard. The machine hummed, a low-frequency vibration that rattled the loose screws on his desk. He initiated the sequence, watching the lines of code cascade across the monitor. He selected a target, a potted flower sitting on the windowsill. The editor struggled, the cursor blinking erratically as it attempted to map the organic data of the petals. Vyro adjusted the gain, pushing more power into the array. The air in the room grew static, the smell of ozone sharp and metallic. He typed a single command, Q, shift 180. The screen froze. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, the flower pulsed. The deep red petals rippled, the color bleeding out, and instantly replacing itself with a vibrant, unnatural blue. It was not a trick of the light. The physical matter had been rewritten. Vyro leaned forward, his breath hitching. He reached out and touched the petals. He typed another command, and the flower turned a translucent, glowing white. He watched, fascinated, as the plant struggled to maintain its biological integrity. The power was intoxicating. He looked around the room, his eyes landing on the walls, the furniture, the very air he breathed. He was the architect of a new world. Vyro turned his attention to the room itself. He typed a command to isolate the local gravity constant. The terminal screen flickered, the text turning a jagged, neon red. He hit enter. Instantly, the heavy silence of the room vanished. His chair lifted off the floor, drifting toward the ceiling like a feather. He pushed off the desk, floating upward, his body weightless. He laughed, a sharp, manic sound that echoed against the rafters. He reached out and grabbed a light fixture, pulling himself toward the wall. He planted his feet against the plaster, standing perpendicular to the floor. It worked. He walked across the wall, his boots crunching against the drywall. But the success came with a cost. The room began to stutter. The edges of the desk blurred, vibrating in and out of existence. Vyro didn't stop. He walked further up the wall, his eyes locked on the monitor floating in midair. He typed a command to invert the gravity field again. He was too busy walking on the ceiling, lost in the rhythm of his own godhood. He didn't notice the shadows detaching or the cracks in the air. Vyro dropped from the ceiling, landing hard on the floor as he killed the gravity script. The room settled, but the air remained charged with a low, humming tension. He pulled the terminal closer, his hands moving with frantic precision. He was done with small objects and room physics. He wanted more. He navigated the interface, diving deep into the root directory of his own existence. A timeline appeared on the screen, a cascading waterfall of events, dates, and choices. He scrolled back, years of his life reduced to lines of editable code. He stopped at a specific entry, the day he lost everything. The cursor pulsed, a steady, rhythmic beat that matched his own heart. He could rewrite it. He could delete the mistake, patch the hole in his history, and build a version of himself that never suffered. He highlighted the block of data, his fingers trembling slightly above the keys. It was the ultimate hack. He wasn't just changing the world, he was editing the architect. The screen cast a pale, sickly light across his face as he stared at the delete command. He prepared to strike, ready to overwrite the foundation of his own life, blind to the fact that the reality he stood upon was already beginning to dissolve beneath his feet. The terminal emitted a high-pitched whine that climbed in frequency, until it became a physical pressure against his eardrums. Smoke curled from the ventilation ports, smelling of ozone and scorched plastic. Vyro ignored the heat radiating from the keyboard. He tapped a command, but the screen lagged. A block of pixels in the center of the display turned a violent, static gray. He tried to override the process, but the machine was fighting back. The reality around him began to fragment. The wall to his left shattered into 1,000 floating cubes, revealing a void of shifting, monochromatic light behind the drywall. He reached out to stabilize the interface, but his hand passed through the desk as if it were made of smoke. The floor beneath him rippled like water, turning into a grid of flickering neon lines. He scrambled to find a grip, but the chair he sat on dissolved into raw data streams. The room was no longer a room. It was a corrupted file. He watched in silence as his own tools began to derez, turning into jagged, floating shards of light. The ceiling peeled away, exposing a sky that looked like a broken television screen. He was losing his grip on the environment, and the machine was screaming, the cooling fans spinning so fast they shattered. Metal groaned under the strain of the reality edit, the very foundation of his workspace buckling. The air itself began to tear, leaving jagged, glowing gashes in the atmosphere. The system warnings flashed red across the screen. But Vyro slammed his palm against the terminal, forcing the override. He bypassed the safety protocols, his fingers flying across the keys as the keyboard sparked and buckled under his touch. The machine was screaming now, a metallic shriek that vibrated through the floorboards. He ignored the smell of burning circuitry. He needed the deep layer rewrite. He needed to reach the core. He typed the final sequence, a string of commands that defied the laws of physics. The terminal screen turned a solid, blinding white before fracturing into a kaleidoscope of jagged, glitching blue light. He did not blink. He stared directly into the source of the corruption as the light expanded, consuming the room. The blue glow washed over his face, casting sharp, flickering shadows. The reality edit was no longer a simulation. It was a physical force. The machine groaned one final time, the metal casing twisting and snapping, but the command was sent. The rewrite had begun. The blinding blue light vanished as if snuffed out by a cosmic hand. In its place, a silence so absolute it rang in his ears settled over the room. Vyro stood motionless, his hand still hovering over the dead terminal. The air did not circulate. Dust motes that had been dancing in the chaotic light now hung suspended in the space between his eyes and the wall, frozen like trapped insects in amber. He tried to draw a breath, but the oxygen felt thick, heavy, and metallic, refusing to enter his lungs with the usual ease. He shifted his weight, and the floorboards did not creak. They remained silent, as if the very concept of sound had been deleted from the local physics. Outside the window, a bird was caught in mid-dive. wings locked in a rigid, impossible angle against the sky. The wind had stopped. He looked at his own hand. The skin was pale, motionless, devoid of the usual microtremors of life. The room was no longer just broken. It was held in a state of unnatural suspension. He realized then that the stillness was not a pause. It was a holding of breath before the collapse. Something was pushing against the other side of reality. The stillness broke with a sound like glass shattering in a vacuum. Right in front of Vyro, the air didn't just vibrate, it split. A thin, jagged line of pure, absolute darkness appeared, hovering 3 feet above the floor. It was not a shadow. It was a puncture, a vertical tear in the geometry of the room that refused to reflect any light. Vyro reached out, his hand trembling, and brought his fingertips within an inch of the fissure. The air around the opening turned frigid instantly, pulling the heat from his skin and leaving his hand numb. He pulled back as a viscous, ink-like substance began to seep from the edges of the tear. It did not drip to the floor. It hung in the air, swirling with a slow, predatory motion. Where the substance touched the floating dust motes, they vanished, erased from existence as if they had never been. The crack widened, the edges fraying like burnt paper, revealing a deeper, darker void behind the curtain of reality. The light in the room began to bend, drawn toward the rift like water down a drain. Vyro watched as the edges of his desk began to lose their definition, dissolving into gray static. The void was not just an opening, it was an active, hungry presence. The crack stopped leaking and started screaming. It was not a sound of air or metal, but a deep tectonic groan that vibrated through the marrow of Vyro's bones. The rift expanded with a violent, jagged snap, tearing the air wide open. A shockwave of pure kinetic force slammed into Vyro, lifting him off his feet and hurling him backward across the room. He hit the far wall with a sickening thud, his vision blurring as the world tilted sideways. The laboratory was no longer a room. It was a collapsing shell. The walls peeled back like layers of dead skin, exposing the raw, humming geometry of the LittyWay. Behind the veil of reality, it was a blinding, prismatic torrent of energy, a river of light and code that defied every law of physics he had ever studied. Debris from the ceiling rained down, but it never hit the floor. It dissolved into golden sparks the moment it touched the periphery of the rift. Vyro scrambled to find purchase, his fingers clawing at the floorboards, but the floor itself was warping, bending upward toward the center of the tear. The roar intensified, drowning out his own ragged breathing. He looked up, his eyes wide as the last remnants of the ceiling vanished into the vortex. Gravity ceased to exist. Vyro felt his weight evaporate as the vortex pulled him forward, his boots sliding across the warped floorboards until they simply disintegrated into light. He reached out, fingers splayed, trying to grab a support beam that was already turning into shimmering code. His hand didn't hit solid matter. It plunged into the LittyWay. The sensation was not heat or cold, but a sudden, violent injection of raw information. Millions of years of universal history flooded his nervous system at once. He saw the architecture of reality, not as physical objects, but as lines of shifting, complex data. His mind buckled under the weight of the truth. He saw stars being written into existence like lines of text and entire galaxies being deleted with a single command. The pain was absolute, a white-hot spike driving through his consciousness. As he realized the universe was merely a draft, a fragile construct waiting for an editor. He tried to scream, but his voice was stripped away, converted into a frequency that echoed through the void. He was no longer just a boy in a room. He was a witness to the source code of everything. The rift pulsed, and with every beat, another layer of his perception was peeled back, exposing the terrifying, hollow nature of the world he had once called home. He was drowning in the infinite, and the infinite was looking back at him. The blinding light of the LittyWay suddenly curdled, turning from gold to a bruised, oily black. The rift stopped expanding and began to stretch, pulled apart by something pushing from the other side. A sound emerged, not a roar, but a wet, rhythmic scraping, like bone dragging across glass. Vyro watched, paralyzed, as a limb forced its way through the tear. It was not flesh, but a jagged collection of shifting geometric planes that defied depth perception. The creature hauled itself into the room, its presence instantly draining the color from the surrounding air. It stood 7 feet tall, a mass of twitching shadows. Every time its feet touched the floor, the wood didn't just break, it vanished, erased from existence. Vyro felt a cold, hollow pressure in his chest as he realized the truth. He had not just opened a door, he had invited a predator into the house of reality. The entity turned its head, a featureless void where a face should be, and locked onto him. It didn't breathe, it didn't blink. It simply existed as a localized error, a glitch that had gained mass and intent. Vyro backed away, his heels hitting the edge of a jagged drop-off. The nightmare took a step forward, and the very air around it began to flicker, as if the universe itself was trying to buffer, struggling to process the impossible intruder. Vyro scrambled backward, his boots sliding on the edge of the void as the floorboards behind him dissolved into static. He lunged for the terminal, his fingers slamming against the keys with frantic precision. The screen was a chaotic mess of scrolling errors, the system struggling to reconcile the presence of the intruder. He didn't have time to debug, he had to rewrite the local physics on the fly. He typed a command sequence, but the keys began to flicker, turning translucent under his touch. He pressed harder, his knuckles white, forcing the hardware to hold its state. The nightmare lunged, a wave of shadow rushing forward to consume the desk. Vyro ignored the encroaching darkness, his eyes locked on the terminal. He bypassed the security protocols, diving deep into the kernel of the room's spatial coordinates. The air grew thin, vibrating with the sound of 1,000 corrupted files. He tapped the final sequence, but the power supply surged, the cables glowing with an unstable violet light. He grabbed the exposed wires, using his own hands as a bridge to complete the circuit. The terminal flared, the monitor turning into a blinding white light that pushed back against the shadow. The reality around him was tearing at the seams. The terminal screamed, a high-frequency whine that shattered the remaining glass in the room. Vyro didn't pull away. He leaned into the surge, his mind acting as the final processor for the patch. He felt his own neural patterns being pulled into the machine, a violent synchronization of biology and binary. The pain was absolute, a white-hot spike driving through his skull as he forced his consciousness to map the rift's chaotic geometry. He wasn't just typing anymore. He was becoming the code. The room turned into a blur of shifting light and sound as he exerted his will over the void. He felt the LittyVerse respond, the fabric of space bending to his command. He pushed his own memories, his fears, and his raw intellect into the breach, using them as structural anchors to seal the tear. The nightmare shrieked, a sound of tearing metal, as it was forcibly re-indexed and locked into a static loop. Vyro's eyes glowed with a flickering violet intensity, his pulse syncing with the rhythm of the universe. He had done it. The rift began to close, but the cost was etched into his very being. He stood amidst the ruins of his room, no longer just a kid with a machine. He was the architect of the glitch. The air in the room rippled like water under a storm. The nightmare surged, a mass of jagged, shifting polygons that defied every law of geometry Vyro had ever learned. He didn't blink. He raised his hands, his fingers tracing glowing, neon blue syntax into the empty air. Every line he drew burned into the atmosphere, a physical barrier of pure logic against the encroaching chaos. The entity lashed out, a whip of darkness that shattered the desk and sent debris floating in zero gravity. Vyro stepped forward, his feet crunching on broken glass, and slammed his palm against a floating string of code. A shockwave of white light erupted, pinning the shadow against the wall. The entity hissed, its form flickering, as it tried to rewrite its own parameters to bypass his defense. Vyro countered instantly, dragging a sequence of... The screaming silence of the rift died down, replaced by a low, rhythmic pulse that vibrated through the floorboards. The chaos stopped. The jagged polygons of the nightmare dissolved into static, leaving behind a jagged, glowing scar etched into the very air. Vyro stood still, his breath hitching in his chest. He looked at the wall where the rift had been. The plaster was gone, replaced by a shimmering, translucent membrane. He reached out, his fingers hovering inches from the surface. The air felt thick, like walking through water. He dropped a piece of broken glass. Instead of hitting the floor, it drifted upward, caught in a localized gravity well. The room was no longer a bedroom. It was a localized pocket of non-Euclidean geometry. He stepped over the wreckage of his terminal. The laws of physics had not just been broken. They had been rewritten. He looked at the ceiling, where shadows now moved independently. He was the anchor of this new reality, and the world outside his door was already beginning to feel like a distant, irrelevant memory. Vyro held his hands up to the dim light. They were no longer just skin and bone. Faint, geometric lines of violet energy traced the veins beneath his palms, pulsing in time with the rhythmic hum of the room. He clenched his fist, and the air around his fingers warped, bending the light into a sharp, distorted prism. He reached for a discarded screwdriver on the floor. As his fingertips brushed the metal, the tool didn't just move. It dissolved into a cloud of glowing, floating voxels, before snapping back into a solid shape, now hovering 3 inches off the ground. He pulled his hand back, his pulse quickening. This was not a temporary side effect of the rift. He had become a living conduit for the LittyWay. He looked toward the glowing scar in the wall, watching as the edges of the rift began to bleed shadow once more. The silence of the room was heavy, pressing against his eardrums like deep water. He was the only thing standing between the world he knew and the void that was already reaching through. Vyro turned. He did not look at the rift, nor at the wreckage of his life. He looked directly into the lens. The violet light in his eyes flared, casting long, shifting shadows that defied the geometry of the room. He walked forward, his boots crunching on glass that turned to dust under his weight. He stopped. The air around him stilled, the chaotic hum of the rift silenced by his presence. He held up a hand, and the shimmering membrane of the wall froze. He was no longer the boy who hacked physics by accident. He was the architect of what came next. Reality was a broken file, and he was the only one with the cursor. He leaned closer, his expression devoid of hesitation. The rules were gone. The old world was a ghost. He reached out, his fingers tracing a line in the empty air, and the space behind him folded like paper. He was the guardian, the glitch, and the rewrite. The world would not be fixed. It would be built anew, and he was the one holding the pen.